Last lecture of the semester. We made it. So, what are we wrapping up today? The autonomic nervous system. That's exactly right. And remember, last time we wrapped up peripheral nervous system and we started more specifically autonomic, right? But when we were starting out with the autonomic stuff, we compared it to another major part of the nervous system, the somatic nervous system. So help me out, remind me, what was one major difference between somatic and autonomic? One's voluntary and one is involuntary. That's true, and that relates to how their effectors are different, right? So that was one of the major things that was different between somatic and autonomic. What were those 2 points?
Somatic is faster.
How come? That's right. We did say that the somatic was faster than autonomic at sending signals back out, right, to the effectors. But why was that? It has to do with the myelination. That's exactly right. Because remember, the axons in the motor neurons of the somatic nervous system have heavy myelination, right? We don't see that in autonomic. Some have light myelination, but then there are others that are unmyelinated. What else is different about the setup here with our motor neurons? Well, we already said the effectors would be different, right? Neurotransmitters, the third major thing that's different. What else is different there with the motor neurons? What? Yeah, with the somatic nervous system, you only have the one motor neuron with its soma in the central nervous system, and it extends all the way out to the effector that it's going to control, right? Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, we have the one neuron with its soma in the central nervous system, but then it extends out to a second one, right? So, oh, we get music in class today. Since we have these two neurons that are signaling to each other here in the autonomic nervous system, we gave them different names, right? What do we call the first one in the chain every time? Preganglionic. That's exactly right. I'm going to erase the screen because there's way too much of my writing on here. So yeah, preganglionic, because ganglia are what? You know what? Exactly. That's when we have a bundle of cell bodies or somas that we find in the peripheral nervous system, right? So since our first neuron in the chain is happening before the area with the ganglion, that's got to be preganglionic. And then the second one we called what? Either postganglionic or ganglionic, either way. Good. What was different about the neurotransmitters? Because you told me, because we said that the effectors are different. We said that the efferent pathways with the motor neurons were different. And then you guys mentioned that neurotransmitters were different, but how are they different?
Two types.
All right, so for one thing, in the autonomic nervous system, we're dealing with two different types of neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and acetylcholine. Whereas in somatic, we only have what? Acetylcholine every single time. That's exactly right. What else is different besides the type of neurotransmitter?
It can be stimulus or inhibitory.
Where?
Autonomic.
Yeah, in the autonomic nervous system. That's why they have the plus and the minus over here, right? That's helping us to remember that depending on where our neurotransmitters are acting, we either have stimulation or inhibition. And that's something we kind of already know because, you know, on the chart they're showing us there's only the one neurotransmitter that's being released by sympathetic nervous system, right? And the sympathetic end was which end? Was it rest and digest?
No.
No.
Fight.
It was the fight or flight end, which speeds up what?
Heart rate.
Speeds up heart rate and cardiovascular stuff, whereas it slows down other areas like what? Yeah, like the digestive system and the urinary system. So if we're thinking about our pluses and minuses for what norepinephrine does, we could add those in by those effectors if we wanted to. What regulates if our neurotransmitters are going to be inhibitory or stimulatory? The specific receptor that they interact with on the target organ. So in other words, the receptors for norepinephrine that we find on the heart are going to be different than the ones that we find on the organs of the digestive system. Yes, they both are receptors that interact with norepinephrine, but when they interact with norepinephrine, they do different things. And you guys already kind of know that from chapter 11, because we learned that neurotransmitters could stimulate or inhibit there depending on if they depolarized or hyperpolarized the cell, right? So you already kind of know that. We're going to add a few details to that here today. One more thing to review to remind us of something before we move on. Notice how all of the preganglionic fibers in the autonomic nervous system are releasing the exact same type of neurotransmitter. It's always acetylcholine, right? So at those points, is acetylcholine capable of doing stimulation or inhibition? No. What does it do at those points? It only stimulates. That's exactly right. So remember how I said it was a great idea to print out this slide and bring it with you today. I would keep that separate from my other notes because we're going to keep adding stuff to it as we go through today's lecture. That way you don't have to read back through all of the slides when you're reviewing stuff when you're studying. And what I did on my sheet was I actually put little pluses in here to remind myself that at all of these points, acetylcholine was going to be stimulatory. It's only when we get to the effectors that we start to see receptors that could stimulate or inhibit. You guys with me so far? All right, then let's move along. So clearly we already know that there are these two major subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. We know sympathetics, fight or flight, parasympathetics, what again? Rest and digest. So when I'm thinking about them and how they're working, I kind of think about them as kind of like battling for control of the organs. Right? Because they both can't be fully active at the same time. Like right now, for most of you guys, while we're sitting here trying to stay awake in A&P, what is more functional? The parasympathetic and the rest and digest end. Yeah. So I always kind of think of that as being like our set point. That's what the body's normally at. But when we have to exercise or when we need to fight, right, or run from danger or whatever, then we have the sympathetic do an override of what the parasympathetic is doing. I do want you to be aware that they aren't the only subdivisions within the autonomic nervous system. There is this enteric division as well, or enteric. We're not going to focus on that part in today's lecture, but I want you to know that that's a subdivision that specifically helps us to regulate certain things in the digestive system. And when you get to A&P2, your professor's probably going to talk about the enteric nervous system a little bit. So just know for now that it's another subdivision of the autonomic nervous system, and it helps us with controlling things in the digestive system. But really, what we're doing today is we're comparing what sympathetic and parasympathetic do. Okay? So, one other thing that I want you to make a little note of before we start doing this major comparison. We saw on the chart that the sympathetic fibers and the parasympathetic fibers both extend out to the same effectors, right? Because like the parasympathetic and sympathetic ends of autonomic Both control heart rate, just at different times, right? Well, we have a term for that. We call that dual innervation. So that tells us that both sympathetic and parasympathetic have axons extending out to control the same tissues. So this chart that I've been popping up on the screen for the last month, it feels like, we're finally at the very end of it as we go here to compare sympathetic and parasympathetic. All right, we already know sympathetic is fight or flight. We already know it speeds up what and what? Cardiovascular and respiratory, exactly. So it's stimulatory in those places. Where is it inhibitory again? The digestive system and the urinary system, exactly. Now on this slide, I'm going to give you some other more specific things that it does that are kind of interesting and applicable to things that you're going to study next semester. So to understand this first point, let's make a little note here about blood flow, because otherwise this doesn't make sense. Make a little note that the blood cannot be maximally everywhere at once. So it's like if a tissue starts to become more active, we've got to send more blood to that tissue. And if we do that, then we're kind of routing the blood away from other areas. It doesn't mean we're stopping blood flow to those areas. We just have less blood going to areas that are less active. Like when I'm exercising, do I need as much blood flow going to the stomach? No, I don't need as much blood flow to the digestive system or the urinary system. But since the skeletal muscle is more active and the heart is more active, we better have more blood flow going to those areas. That's one thing that the sympathetic nervous system does. It also is going to do bronchodilation, which is a term you're going to hear more about next semester. Now, you don't need to know that you don't need to know this term bronchioles just yet, but I do want you to know that tubes in the respiratory system, tubes that are connecting the lungs to the external environment, are going to dilate. And what does that mean if a tube dilates? Exactly, so it's going to increase in diameter. Why would we want that to happen when we're exercising? What's that going to do for the respiratory system? Faster flow of air, yeah. So not necessarily faster, right? Because that's what the lungs are doing. That's going to control how fast it is. And the muscles really that control the lungs. But by opening up the tubes, we get more airflow going through. So not only does the respiratory rate increase, but the depth of breathing increases too. So we're bringing more air in and out of the lungs with each breath because we open up that tubing more, we dilate it. So that's another thing the sympathetic nervous system is doing for us. It's a point we're going to revisit later too. One last thing that I want you to specifically make a note about is that the sympathetic nervous system causes the liver to release glucose. And when it releases glucose, it adds it to the blood. Why does that make total sense that we would want to be adding glucose to the blood while sympathetic's acting?
So the tissues can make ATP?
Exactly. That's why we have more blood flow going to those tissues, right? Skeletal muscle and heart is working harder. That means we've got to deliver more oxygen and nutrients to it so that they can make ATP. The liver is one of the places in the body where we can store a lot of glucose. So that's why we're pulling the glucose out of the liver and we're adding it to the blood. That way when we increase this blood flow to the tissues that are more active, there's plenty of glucose for them to use to make the ATP. All right, parasympathetic, we already know, is rest and digest. We already know that it slows down things like the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system while increasing the activity of things like the digestive system. That's what this is referring to. And it also increases the activity of the urinary system, right? The thing that's on this slide that we haven't talked about yet is the parasympathetic nervous system actually controls your eyes. So think about it. While we're sitting here in place, well, we need to see things that are closer to us, right? Like our books and our notes. So what the parasympathetic nervous system does is it causes the pupil to constrict. So remember, the pupil was the hole in the middle of the eye. So we decrease the size of that, and we change the shape of the lens within the eye to accommodate for closer vision. When we're running from danger or exercising and that fight or flight is going on, it makes sense that we would need vision that allows us to see further away, right? That way you know where you're going as you're escaping from danger. Back when I learned about the autonomic nervous system, it was from this French guy, and he kept talking about the running of the bulls. So he would say, you know, when the bull comes and he's chasing you, the sympathetic nervous system kicks on. So if you're running from the bulls, your pupils have to dilate. Your lens has to change so you can see far off to get away from them. So that's kind of general introduction to what they do. We're going to compare them in just a moment. But before we do, I think it might have been in this class that somebody had asked me about reflexes. It was one of my classes last time. Because when we talked about the peripheral nervous system, we focused on somatic reflexes where we were controlling the skeletal muscle, right? And in one of my classes, somebody asked, well, aren't there autonomic reflexes too? Well, there are. We call them visceral reflexes because they typically involve the viscera, the internal organs. And if we look at the signaling loop for a visceral reflex, you should notice that it looks an awful lot like what we talked about last time with those somatic reflexes. What did we call the change with the somatic reflex? The stimulus. So notice we start out with the change, a stimulus again. And what sensed that change? The receptors always sense the change. The only difference about the receptors here is where we find them. They're in different tissues, not the skeletal muscle. And then when that receptor gets activated, what does it have to do to get a signal to the central nervous system? It's got to create a graded potential that causes an action potential in who? In a sensory neuron every time. Well, that's what they're showing us happening here, right? The receptor activated a sensory neuron and sent a signal into the central nervous system. Where did the integration happen for the other reflexes? In the spinal cord, just like it is here. The only really major difference, besides the tissue that you're controlling, is how we send the information back out. With somatic nervous system, when we were looking at the reflexes last time, how many motor neurons did we have? We just had the one that had its one soma, right, that was in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Doesn't want to cooperate with that dot. But yeah, we had like this one soma, and then it's extended directly out to the effector, right? But we're not seeing that here, are we? We're not seeing that. Instead, we're seeing our chain of two neurons because we have the one red one, and then we have this other one that's kind of a pinkish color, right? So we have a two neuron chain with our preganglionic fiber signaling to the ganglionic one or postganglionic one in order to get our signal from the spine back out to the effector. And that's why I even underlined that for you over here to emphasize that point. So you might want to put a star by it. It's something we already know from that table that I keep pulling up on the screen. But now we're just seeing it with the reflexes. Also, remember this is kind of related to stuff from the last chapter too. We talked about referred pain, right? What was referred pain? Exactly. We feel pain because something's wrong and something's getting damaged, right? But with referred pain, we feel pain in a different area that's not getting damaged, even though there's damage happening somewhere else. Like we talked about the heart attack, right? Yeah. Where the heart muscle tissue is getting damaged, but we typically feel that in the left arm. That's because our sensory neurons for our viscera, our internal organs, tend to be bundled up in tracks next to the ones for the skeletal muscles. And then the brain gets confused and it thinks that the signal is coming from somewhere else. Right? We talked about that before. Keep it in mind again. Okay, so let's really get down to the nitty-gritty stuff here and compare sympathetic versus parasympathetic. When we do this comparison, we can specifically look at the fibers as well as the receptors to see like what's releasing a particular neurotransmitter and where specifically does that neurotransmitter go. When it comes to the fibers, one name should be pretty intuitive because you can see a neurotransmitter name in that name. So cholinergic fibers must release what kind of neurotransmitter? Acetylcholine every time. Adrenergic are a little less straightforward, but like if you go for a run or you exercise or you get stressed about something, they say that you release a lot of what? Adrenaline. Notice how we have adrenaline hidden in this name. That's because that's a common term for one of our neurotransmitters, norepinephrine. So the adrenergic fibers release norepinephrine. And just as a reminder about where we find these different fibers, remember the acetylcholine is released by the preganglionic fibers, as well as the postganglionic ones in the parasympathetic nervous system, and technically in the somatic nervous system as well, right? Whereas adrenergic, we really only saw that norepinephrine being released by the postganglionic ones in the sympathetic end. I'll get back to this point about exceptions to the rule in just a minute, but if you have your table out, if I were you, I would just write down quickly here where I have cholinergic fibers versus adrenergic fibers. That way I don't have to go back and review all of my notes to remember who's who. Now, as far as this exception to the rule business goes, not all postganglionic sympathetic fibers release norepinephrine. So I do want you to know that there are a couple of specific areas where the sympathetic nervous system releases acetylcholine instead. Areas like sweat glands and blood vessels, especially the blood vessels located closer to the skeletal muscle that are going to be more critical during exercise. All right. So we know about the fibers. Now we need to learn about the receptors. Ironically enough, notice the name for the grouping for the receptors that bind acetylcholine. Same name as the fibers, right? But there are two major subclassifications within the cholinergic receptors. So more specifically, acetylcholine could bind nicotinic receptors or muscarinic receptors, and we name those based off of other things that bind those areas. So yeah, acetylcholine binds them, but nicotine binds nicotinic ones, and muscarine, a mushroom toxin, can bind the muscarinic receptors. So that's how they actually got their names. Those are also classes though. So within those, we can have specific subtypes, especially within the muscarinic ones. All right, so let's see where we find these different types of cholinergic receptors. With the nicotinic ones, we find it on motor end plates on the skeletal muscle cells, okay. We also find it on the ganglion and on the adrenal medulla. That was the adrenal gland. Remember, renal meant kidneys, so those were the glands that were sitting on top of the kidneys. What kind of effect does acetylcholine have at this point? It's stimulatory. What about with the ganglia? When the preganglionic fibers release the acetylcholine, that was always stimulatory as well, right? And it's the same deal here when our preganglionic fiber releases to the adrenal gland. That's stimulatory as well. So the nicotinic receptors are kind of easy. Every time we release acetylcholine that first time, it's going to go interact with a nicotinic receptor so that it can have a stimulatory effect. So if you're looking back at your little table, since there are so many places where we have nicotinic receptors, you might just want to put, nicotinic in its own little circle, and I would just circle those areas where you find those receptors. And honestly, if we look at this table, we can predict where we're going to find the muscarinic ones that also bind acetylcholine. Where are we going to find the muscarinic ones? Where do we have acetylcholine being released that we haven't talked about yet? With the effectors for the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Because we have the acetylcholine being released here, but we didn't talk about nicotinic receptors binding to this one. So we must have muscarinic receptors on all of these guys here. So that's stuff we already know. The tricky part is that when acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic receptor, it can have either a stimulatory or inhibitory effect, and that is because there are many different subtypes of muscarinic receptors, and I'm not going to make you learn all of the different subtypes here, but you do need to be aware that that's why sometimes it inhibits and sometimes it stimulates. Like, we're talking about parasympathetic nervous system right now, right? What's it going to stimulate? Yeah, so the smooth muscle in the walls of the organs of the digestive system must have a subtype of muscarinic receptor that stimulates that tissue. But if we think about like the heart, that's another effector for the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Yeah, we're going to have a different type of muscarinic receptor there that's going to actually inhibit the muscle, slowing it down there. Nicotinic. So the question was, what's the receptor for the skeletal muscle, right? Because that also receives it gets the signal from acetylcholine. So if you didn't catch that before, nicotinic receptors here, muscarinic receptors here, but there are different subtypes depending on what organ you're looking at. So we have stimulatory subtypes here, inhibitory subtypes here. Any questions about any of that? Is there anything you guys didn't catch? All right, then we're going to move on. So with the receptors that bind norepinephrine, actually let's take a step back. Where are we going to see the receptors for norepinephrine? So they're going to respond to the sympathetic nervous system. Where are we going to find them? The receptors that norepinephrine binds. We're going to find them only on the effectors, right? Because that's where we're releasing norepinephrine. So the same place where we had the different types of muscarinic receptors, we have different types of what we call adrenergic receptors. And I do want you to know the names for the different subtypes of adrenergic receptors, because they're subtypes that we modify a lot with different medications. Like if you've ever, well, you'll see when we see the names. So the two major classes of adrenergic receptors are alpha adrenergic and beta adrenergic receptors. And then within those, there are different subtypes, so like alpha 1 and alpha 2 adrenergic receptors and beta 1, 2, or 3 adrenergic receptors. If you've ever heard of beta blockers, that we give people that have cardiovascular problems, guess what we're blocking? We're blocking some of those beta receptors that respond to the norepinephrine that's being released by the sympathetic nervous system. And once again here, just like we talked about with the muscarinic ones, the effect could stimulate or inhibit depending upon exactly what type, what subtype norepinephrine interacts with. And we already made our note on this chart about where we find our adrenergic receptors. So I'm going to skip over to this table. And everybody look scared. Don't look scared. I'm not going to make you memorize every single place where you find every single subtype of alpha and beta adrenergic receptor. I have this on here to make a specific point, because I keep saying sometimes it inhibits, sometimes it stimulates, right? Well, I want to give you a specific example where you can see that. So notice what kind of adrenergic receptors we have in the heart. We have beta 1 adrenergic receptors. In the tubing that connects the lungs to the external environment, we have beta 2s. So when the sympathetic nervous system releases norepinephrine, and that norepinephrine binds to the beta 1s, it has a stimulatory effect that helps us to increase the heart rate. At the same time that norepinephrine interacts with beta 1s, it also interacts with beta 2s, and it inhibits them. Because if it inhibits the beta 2s that are controlling the smooth muscle in the tubing for the lungs, well, then that smooth muscle is going to relax. And when it relaxes, that's going to cause the dilation of those tubes, opening them up so that we can breathe more air in and out with each breath. Questions about any of that? All right, so know that example. Few more things and then we're done with this chapter. So we already know autonomic nervous system has dual innervation. What did that mean again?
Parasympathetic and sympathetic both work together.
Okay, yeah, we know that the fibers in the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic both extend out to control the same organs, right? Except we know that they control those organs in opposite ways, right? What one speeds up, the other slows down, and vice versa. So we have a term for that too, a more concise way to say it, they're antagonistic. So, and I could talk through, what they speed up and slow down again, but I think we all have that pretty much down, right? We know what sympathetic speeds up and slows down and what parasympathetic does. Okay. And we're going to move on to tone. What did that word tone mean when we talk about it in AMP? Yeah, so we talked about it with muscle tone. We did. And with the muscle tone stuff, we said that even when we say the skeletal muscle is relaxed, it still has a little bit of activity going on, right? A little bit of contraction. It's like that with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Even when we say that, like we're relaxed right now, right? Which means that who has control? Parasympathetic has control right now. But the sympathetic nervous system still has some tone. It still has some activity in specific areas. And one of the most important areas is with regard to the blood vessels, where it's helping us to regulate blood pressure. So when I think about the control from this tone, it's not like an on-off switch for a light. It's more like those dimmer switches where you can just turn the light down or crank it up. It's like that with the sympathetic nervous system. So we could call it vasomotor tone because vaso is related to blood vessels, but I want to get to this. So when we're exercising and the sympathetic nervous system is more active, that causes blood vessels to constrict, which is going to help to increase blood pressure. That's why you never want to take a resting blood pressure when somebody's been moving around. You want them to sit for a little bit. Even when they're relaxed, like you guys are right now, the sympathetic nervous system is still controlling your blood vessels. It's just because the sympathetic nervous system isn't signaling as much, we see the smooth muscle in the blood vessels relax to open up the blood vessels and drop the blood pressure. So it's more like a dimmer switch. We also have parasympathetic tone, and most of the areas where we see this shouldn't be too surprising. Like it makes sense that it would have control of digestive stuff and urinary stuff, right? And it would still have low levels of control on those areas even when we're exercising and the sympathetic nervous system is more active. The tone that it has on the heart is going to be a really important thing that you learn about in AMP2. And, they may call it parasympathetic tone. More frequently, when we're talking about the effects on the heart, we call it vagal tone, which slows the heart rate at rest. Notice what's hidden in there.
Vagus.
Exactly, the vagus nerve, which was the only cranial nerve that left the head and went down to the cavities, right? The thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities. So it's like when the sympathetic nervous system kicks on, it does an override of this tone. So sympathetic takes over control. It's not that the parasympathetic stops signaling to the heart. It's just the sympathetic nervous system overrides what parasympathetic is doing. Similar deal when it comes to digestive and urinary activity. So that's all stuff that we know. Okay, so I've been emphasizing parasympathetic and sympathetic are always at odds with each other, right? They're fighting for control of the body. Well, there are some points where they have to cooperate, actually, and that's with reproduction. So I do want you to know that parasympathetic nervous system is going to be responsible for controlling certain blood vessels, like those in the penis to cause the erection. And the sympathetic nervous system, at the same time, is going to be regulating other smooth muscle and tubing that causes the orgasm. So do know about these cooperative effects of the two sides. They aren't always at odds with each other. Sometimes they have to work together. Even though we emphasize that in most effectors there's dual innervation, where we have fibers from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system extending out to control things, there are certain areas where the sympathetic nervous system only controls it. So I do want you to know those areas are sweat glands, the adrenal gland, the one that sat on top of the kidneys. Erector pili, what was that? Exactly, that was the smooth muscle that we found in the integument that helped the hairs to stand on end, right? I know I have kidneys on here, and kidneys are part of the urinary system. We're talking about a specific function there, and I'm going to show you that in just a second, okay? So it's not like the sympathetic nervous system has total control of everything the kidney is doing. It has control of something specific in there, as well as having control of most, not all, but most blood vessels in the body. Okay, so why does it have specific control over these parts? One reason is for thermoregulation, and that should be fairly intuitive, because when we exercise and the skeletal muscle is more active, what's the skeletal muscle producing? Yeah, it's producing a lot of heat. That's why you get warm when you exercise, right? Why is that again? Exactly, because the skeletal muscle is converting chemical energy, ATP, into mechanical energy as we contract and move that muscle. Well, yes, the body temperature does increase a bit when we exercise, but it would actually increase a lot more if the sympathetic nervous system didn't have ways to cool us off. One of those is listed on the slide and should be really easy. Which one? Well, yeah, but how? Yeah, because the sympathetic nervous system has control of those sweat glands, right? Also, because it has control of the blood vessels, it can route where the blood goes. And not only does it route more blood out to the skeletal muscle that's working so hard, it also regulates the blood out to the skin. Because if we send the blood out to the skin, now we're bringing the body heat up next to the external environment so that it can leave. So there are two ways that it does thermoregulation. With regard to what it does with the kidney, it causes the kidney to release this enzyme, renin. And renin triggers the production of a hormone that we call angiotensin II. So when we talk about renin and angiotensin II, we call that the renin-angiotensin system. And it is something that haunts you in AMP2. It comes up in so many chapters. So for now, all I want you to know is that the sympathetic nervous system helps to trigger this renin-angiotensin system from the kidney in order to help us regulate blood pressure.
So that regulates like how?
It helps to regulate blood volume, to regulate blood pressure, but when you get to that, you're going to spend days talking about that stuff because it's complicated. So for now, just know, sympathetic nervous system triggers the renin-angiotensin system from the kidney, and that has something to do with regulating blood pressure. The other unique effects of the sympathetic nervous system tie into its role in helping us control that skeletal muscle. Clearly, if the skeletal muscle is more active, it's going to be more metabolically active, right? Because it's going to be doing more cellular respiration to make more ATP. And if we have those cells making more ATP, then we're going to need more glucose in the blood. And we saw that, right? Because the sympathetic nervous system pulls that glucose from where? From the liver, exactly. The liver's like the processing plant, and it's also a place for storing some things like glucose. Is glucose the only fuel we can use to make ATP? No, we can also use fat. So it shouldn't be surprising that the sympathetic nervous system helps us to pull that fat out of areas like adipose tissue. That way the skeletal muscle can use it to make ATP. Not just skeletal muscle, also the heart too. Last major point, and we are done with this lecture. When we compare what the parasympathetic nervous system does to sympathetic, one has more localized effects, whereas the other has more diffuse effects, and that's going to control how long their effects last. What do I mean when I say that something is more localized? Yeah, it's happening in a more specific area, whereas if it's diffuse, it tends to be body-wide. So parasympathetic is going to happen, its effects happen more locally. They happen right there at the effectors. And because it's more isolated, it's going to be more short-lived. It's easier to turn it off. Sympathetic's the opposite. It tends to be more body-wide. And if it's happening more body-wide, it's going to take us longer to shut it off. So, like when you exercise. You've exercised really hard for like 30 minutes and you go sit down. Does your heart rate immediately drop back to what it should be? No, and your respiratory rate doesn't either, right? So you know about this effect of the sympathetic nervous system. You see that in yourself. The question that we need to ask ourselves is why that is. And that little chart that I've been popping up for you guys gives us a hint about why. What was different about sympathetic versus parasympathetic? Well, it's true. We had different neurotransmitters that were released. That is true. But like when we looked at the parasympathetic nervous system, we only had one option, right? You had your preganglionic fiber releasing a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, to the postganglionic one, right? You only had the one option. So what's different here with the sympathetic end?
There's no postganglion.
You have this second option, right? You have the second option where we have a gland that's making the exact same chemical that our neurons release, right? Because we see these same little green dots here. Except the norepinephrine that the adrenal gland makes? Is it being directly delivered to the effector? No, it's getting into the blood. It's jumping on the highway. Which means that it's going to take us time to build up the levels so that they have an effect. And if we've taken this time to build the levels of norepinephrine up in the blood, guess what? It's going to take time for us to clear it back out to a point where it doesn't have an effect anymore. And that's why your heart rate and your respiratory rate take a while to slow down after you've exercised, at least if you've done it right. And that is the last major point for this chapter. So do you guys have questions? All right, then I'll see you down in lab.